Good afternoon. I'm Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, Vice Chair of the Committee of Homeland Security. Welcome to today's virtual forum where we will be discussing misinformation during the coronavirus pandemic. Misinformation comes in many forms, and it can include false information spread unknowingly or unintentionally, as well as false information from bad actors. In a public health crisis like this, it's more important than ever that people have access to reliable information about how to keep themselves and their families safe. But it can be difficult for many Americans to differentiate between trustworthy guidance and dangerous misinformation when both proliferate. Because of the sheer volumes of claims out there about this virus, the International Fact Check Network has called this, quote, the biggest challenge fact checkers have ever faced. As a public health nurse, I am all too familiar with the harm done by medical misinformation. Vaccine hesitancy and misinformation are already at dangerous levels in America. The dissemination of false narratives stoking baseless fears about vaccination threatens the health of children, seniors, pregnant women, cancer patients, and other vulnerable populations. Now, during a pandemic on a scale that we've not seen in a century, these trends are more troubling than ever. The stakes are truly life and death. So I'm glad that we're joined today by two distinguished experts, Renee DeRusta and Nina Jankowicz, who can help us better understand the threat of false information during a public health crisis, share key insights from their research on this topic, and assist the committee as we chart a path forward. But first, I want to thank my colleague, Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin, for joining me for this important conversation. I'll turn it over to Congresswoman Slotkin now for her opening remarks. Congresswoman.
Great. Thank you, Congresswoman Underwood. It is great to be with you. I wish we were in person. I miss you. And we sit next to each other in the Homeland Security Committee. So I would much rather be sitting next to you, kind of whispering back and forth. But I'm thrilled, especially on an issue that is near and dear to my heart. I'm a former CIA officer and Pentagon official. This issue of disinformation is a critical one to protecting our country, protecting our institutions, protecting the peace between us here in the United States. Congresswoman has walked us through a number of the ways that disinformation around the coronavirus is affecting us. I wanted to just bring in a little bit of a personal perspective of how some of these things are playing out on the ground. I represent a district in mid-Michigan, and we've seen some pretty concerted campaigns around distrust and division around the issue of coronavirus. And we've seen it be damaging, and as the Congresswoman said, even deadly. Just down the road in my own town, we just had a man arrested for assault after he entered a local dollar store. He was asked by a clerk to wear a mask. He ended up wiping his nose and his face on her clothing in anger in response to her request. In a neighboring county, we had another store clerk physically assaulted under similar circumstances. And sadly, in Flint, Michigan, just 20 minutes away, a store clerk was shot and killed in a dispute over a request to wear a mask. So it's unclear why those events, what inspired those particular events, but it is fair to say that they represent exactly the kind of distrust and anger and even violence and that malevolent actors are working to spread. So again, as a CIA officer, disinformation long precedes social media. It long precedes the coronavirus. This is something that has gone on probably since the beginning of time. But it really appears that disinformation, the sort of machine around it, has really been in overdrive around COVID-19. The goals of people who are pushing disinformation tend to be pretty similar, both on coronavirus but preceding. They want to sow distrust and disbelief between us. They want to amplify divisions and expose those divisions, because if we as Americans are busy fighting amongst ourselves, focused on ourselves, focused internally, we're not focused on those actors, whether they be Chinese actors, Russian actors, Iranian actors, non-state actors. When they keep us fighting each other, then we have less time to focus on them. And it's extremely important that leadership take responsibility, leaders of all kinds, congressional, executive branch, to tell the truth and be clear and consistent about what is true and what is not true. By my count, and I hope that our guests will give us some more detail and color on some of these issues, here's what we've seen during coronavirus. We've seen a deliberate attempt to spread disinformation on issues. We've seen the real promotion of conspiracy-based websites, both by human beings, by state-sponsored networks, so literally by government-sponsored associates, also by bots, right? The sort of use of bots to spread things. We've seen Chinese, Russian, Iranian, and Venezuelan networks pairing up and sort of communicating within their networks to spread information, to supercharge that information. And in a note that was particularly disturbing is there is at least some evidence that we have seen put out in the press that Chinese operatives sent disinformation text messages directly to American citizen phones. That's something that I have personally never seen in my time, so that is a disturbing new development. I hope we can get into all of this through our guests. I'm thrilled to have everybody here. Thank you, Congresswoman Underwood, for putting this together and standing by to get into the Q&A.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman Slotkin. Now we'd like to invite our panelists to share some initial comments. I'll begin with Ms. Renee DiResta. Ms. DiResta is the research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory. She investigates the spread of malign narratives across social networks and assists policymakers in understanding and responding to the problem. She's advised Congress, the State Department, and other academic, civic, and business organizations. And she studied disinformation and computational propaganda in the context of pseudoscience conspiracies, terrorism, and state-sponsored information warfare. Ms. DiResta, thank you for joining us. We'll begin by hearing your initial thoughts on this important topic.
Thanks, Representative Underwood and Slotkin. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. My prior work with Congress has focused a lot on state-sponsored actors, and particularly covert and subversive operations. But I think understanding how the information ecosystem facilitates a misled public with regard to COVID-19, we're looking at a little bit of a broader problem. So this is not the first epidemic in the age of social media, but it's the first global pandemic in which the world has simultaneously been focused on the same topic for a sustained period of time, particularly as users are looking actively for information as the virus makes its way to their locale. So those with a significant stake in communicating their point of view in response to that search for information include state actors who are motivated by geopolitical power, but also by the need to preserve domestic public opinion. So this is something that we see particularly from China, the need to ensure that they present a favorable opinion of their own response to their own people. We see politically motivated domestic actors here in the United States. That's a force that we can't neglect to understand. And then we see the economically motivated grifters and spammers who are spreading misinformation, oftentimes for personal enrichment. And those are the folks who are attempting to sell fake cures, books, undermine confidence in infectious disease experts, that sort of activity. So for 3 quick opening observations, influence in this realm really hasn't been limited to foreign actors. The information ecosystem is designed to let anybody use the system to communicate a point of view. There are persistent social communities that are looking for information, that are using viral sharing tools to kind of push particular types of information out. And one of the real challenges for us is understanding networked activism, which is a protected political right in America and a freedom that we want to maintain, that freedom of expression, while recognizing at the same time the downstream harms of those groups pushing viral health misinformation. Observation 2, when you have those communities, that real networked activism is sometimes co-opted for information operations. And we've seen particularly symbiotic relationships where foreign malign actors, such as Russia, will infiltrate or will activate communities that are already predisposed to share a particular point of view to pick up on that homegrown unrest or distrust and exacerbate it to kind of make it look like it's a dominant point of view. It's often very hard to see where that domestic to foreign line is crossed or to attribute the activity quickly enough to stop it. So this is where, per some of the points that Representative Slotkin made, we see stories making attributions to foreign actors, but oftentimes they're a little bit vague, and so there's an initial distrust, even from the public, that the foreign adversary is participating in the conversation as well. They see it as a domestic conversation, domestic issue. And then finally, I would say Although most of the focus on mis and disinformation has been around the subversive bots and trolls, there is another set of broadcast tools that are available to state actors, and that's the overt propaganda via state media. So many foreign state media channels do have a significant audience with the American social media ecosystem. China in particular, they run targeted ads to ensure that their content is reaching new audiences. And one thing that our team at Stanford has observed with regard to Chinese state media in particular is that they've increased the volume of their ad targeting, and they've really changed their focus from generic pro-China narratives to stories specific to their narratives, the point of view that they want to push out related to their handling of the COVID-19 situation. So very strong pro-CCP ad campaigns related to COVID-19. So it is not really clear yet what social platforms should be doing to ensure that Americans are properly informed, while also not compromising the cultural value of an open media ecosystem. I look forward to discussing these challenges and the steps that Congress can take to address them.
Thank you so much. And I believe Congresswoman Slotkin is going to introduce our next guest.
Yes, great. I have the honor of welcoming Nina Jankowicz to the panel. Ms. Jankowicz is a disinformation fellow at the Wilson Center in DC. There, she carries out research outlining comparative regulatory approaches to countering online influence campaigns and content moderation on social media. Her areas of study include Western approaches to combating Russian disinformation campaigns and the motivations behind foreign influence campaigns. Ms. Jankowicz, we will turn it over to you for your opening comments. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Vice Chairwoman Underwood and Representative Slotkin. It's an honor to be here. As COVID-19 began to spread around the world, it was already clear that the pandemic would provide the ideal conditions for the fast and deadly transmission of another public health and national security risk, disinformation. One of the first indications of this infodemic's potency came from Ukraine, as the country evacuated citizens from Wuhan in late February. A fake viral email alleging to be from Ukraine's Ministry of Health claimed that the country already had 5 cases of coronavirus, leading to violent protests in the town where evacuees were being housed. The Ukrainian government debunked the message and asserted it originated outside of Ukraine, but not before public safety was put at risk. In recent weeks in the United States, we've witnessed our own disinformation-fueled protests that endanger public safety. While foreign actors like Russia are certainly capitalizing on the pandemic, exploiting societal fissures to further their foreign policy goals, as the Kremlin has done for the past decade plus, disinformation originating within our borders also runs rampant. The uncertainty, fear, and widespread distrust in institutions that characterizes the COVID era means that people are trying to fill in the informational gaps that the pandemic presents. And disinformation has never only been about fake news. In fact, the most convincing disinformation is often grounded in emotional, visceral truth. Social media platforms, which capitalize on our emotions to drive engagement, amplify the malign content, whether it comes from foreign actors, elected officials politicizing the crisis, or internet hucksters trying to make a quick buck selling snake oil cures. My research shows that governments which mount successful responses to disinformation have 2 things in common. First, they recognize the human element to disinformation campaigns and employ citizens-based solutions to mitigate them. And second, their political leadership does not engage in the same malign information tactics that purveyors of disinformation do. The COVID infodemic has made clear the stakes of the information war. Nothing less than the health and security of our citizens, our economy, and our democracy is at risk. It has also made clear that as it stands, the United States is losing. If we are to learn from this crisis, the US government will begin to invest more in efforts to increase Americans' understanding of malign information tactics. Congress will work to pass common sense social media regulation that respects democratic standards and human rights law and increases transparency, arming the American people with the information they need to make more informed decisions about what media they consume. And politicians across the board will recognize that disinformation is not a partisan issue, but a democratic one. I look forward to discussing these responses with you in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So let's start the QA. My first question is for Ms. Jankowicz. Recent reporting by the New York Times has revealed how Russia has coordinated a decade-long disinformation campaign to undermine America's trust in medical experts and in government institutions. Can you tell us more about how these bad actors use disinformation to create confusion and chaos that threatens the public health in our country? And how would you advise Congress to counteract such operations?
Sure. Thank you so much. So I think the first thing that's important to point out is that it's not just about public health necessarily. Russia or any other bad actor will seize on the fissures in our societies, whether it's a global pandemic that's come up now or other hot button issues that are cropping up in order to drive us apart. And they'll often plant confusing narratives. We saw this a bit more overtly during the 2016 election, where they were spread by clearly foreign accounts that were controlled from the Internet Research Agency in Moscow. But as Renee, I believe, mentioned in her remarks, often these days, bad actors are forced to go underground because the social media platforms have taken some steps to kind of push back against the tactics that we saw in 2016. They've adapted, the bad actors have. And so they're planting these narratives in often trustworthy media. We call this information laundering. And we're seeing, something jump from a channel like RT or Sputnik onto other more trustworthy outlets in the United States. Sometimes they're on the fringes of either side of the political spectrum. But people are looking for, again, a way to fill in those informational gaps. And so it's important to understand that until we fill them ourselves, the Russians or the Chinese or any other bad actor, and again, domestic disinformers play a big role in this, are going to keep doing this stuff. And so I'm a big advocate of educating the American public about these issues. This is what I call the citizens-based approach to countering disinformation. It is not a panacea. I want to make that clear. It is one part of a strategy that Congress, hopefully will employ in the future. And I know there are a couple bills on the Hill right now looking at this issue. But if you look at countries like Sweden, even like Ukraine, which is on the front lines of the information war, anyone who's had success in pushing back tries to educate their citizens in how to spot disinformation, how to sift through the informational flow that we are all hit with on a daily basis. And that is certainly true during the coronavirus disinformation process. And they also are educating their public servants. Countries like Poland, for example, and the Czech Republic have had some success in educating their federal employees in order to push back at this. So we need to think at a kind of a multi-generational level. This isn't only about school children, it's also about voting age populations. In fact, I would argue it's more about voting age populations. And I think that is something that we've neglected for a really long time in the United States, and it has to go hand in hand with things like social media regulation, understanding what the platform's responsibilities are toward users, and giving users a method of recourse if they feel that content has been removed incorrectly or that their voice isn't being equitably heard. And I'm sure we can get into some of those regulatory responses a bit in more detail later. Thank you.
Thank you. Congresswoman Slotkin.
So my question is for Ms. DiResta. So just to bring this home for people who are watching, can you sort of outline what it's like what goes through sort of how these disinformation actors leverage social media, right? A lot of people in my district watch this pandemic video that's been going around. So I know you've commented a little bit on social media on this issue. Can you walk us through like the amount of work and planning and prep that goes into spreading a message and getting it to go viral?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think social media was designed both to connect people, but also to connect people to advertising. And so when you have certain tools available to you, you can run what are effectively sophisticated marketing campaigns for ideas. And in the case of something like the pandemic video, that was actually probably the third or fourth video featuring that particular discredited scientist that achieved an audience larger than about 800,000 views on YouTube. So it was not actually the first video. But the way that these groups work is you have a compelling piece of content. So there's the content creation process. Then you have networked distributors. So this is, as I was referring to before, these kind of persistent communities that are active on social media constantly because they're groups that people have really aligned around. A core part of their identity is I am a person who believes this sort of vaccine narrative, or I am a person who believes in chemtrails, or even much more mundane. Right now, we're seeing a lot of I am a person who wants to reopen my state, and so I'm joining a reopen group. And so these are, again, regularly perfectly legitimate forms of political expression. There's no foreign interference angle to that. They're just where people choose to spend their time and their activism efforts. But what you see happen is the ways in which these communities are networked and the ways in which that feeds into the social media amplification algorithms that Nina was mentioning. You do begin to see instances in which content is very rapidly shared from person to person and from group to group. And as it makes those hops, if it's compelling, then the combination of content plus dissemination leads to the algorithms beginning to amplify it. And so the challenge as platforms look at these things is to understand what to do in response to emerging viral misinformation. If you take it down after it's gone viral, unfortunately, you have a second wave of shares and controversy related to the conspiracy of censorship surrounding the takedown. Unfortunately, we've seen this in a number of crisis video situations that platforms have tried to tamp down on for various reasons. And in this particular case, as YouTube took it down for health misinformation, it was reframed as YouTube and then Facebook censoring a political point of view, because oftentimes there's a political angle to the health misinformation, which in the case of coronavirus has been, these are people who don't want to reopen our state. These are people who are trying to keep beneficial drugs from us. And this doctor here, this PhD, is a whistleblower. Ergo, we should be listening to her because she's telling us the truth about what our government is keeping from us. And that's a very powerful narrative for a lot of people who don't necessarily feel that they understand what's going on or are getting, don't feel that they're getting very good information from their government.
Great, thank you. Lauren, back over to you. Does that sound right?
Okay, yes. So I want to build on what Mr. Ressa was just talking about. We know that social media is such an important source of information in all of our communities. A majority of Americans do check a social site at least once a day. But as Ms. Jankowicz mentioned, news reports have also highlighted that large coronavirus misinformation campaigns have spread in other sources. So she called out placing in reputable news sources, but we also know that they've spread through text and email. So this is for either one of you if you want to take it. Can you discuss any differences in the approach that we should take in combating misinformation that spreads on these other mediums as opposed to just social media platforms? We can start with Mr. Resta.
Sure. So, excuse me. So, email forwards and things like that are timeless, timeless method of transmitting misinformation, unfortunately. And for that, I think really it's ensuring that fact checkers have done their work in such a way that it's discoverable. That's one of the real challenges. Oftentimes you see the fact check doesn't go viral the way the initial misinformation did. This is particularly challenging on something like WhatsApp and encrypted messaging spaces, where even seeing the misinformation is a challenge. At least on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, researchers on the outside can see it. So one of the real challenges is ensuring that when people go searching for information, when they go to do the fact check, they say, hey, this forward seems a little bit off to me. Did a Stanford doctor really say that? Did Johns Hopkins really say that? That content is what surfaced for them, that they don't just see a further reinforcement in an information void in which the only information that's surfaced is the information that the manipulator wants you to see.
Awesome. And Ms. Jankowicz?
Sure, thank you. So I think everything Renee said, of course, is absolutely correct. And one thing I think people often struggle with, if we're going to give your constituents a couple of tips here, when they're interacting with folks where these messages are getting forwarded, whether that's on WhatsApp or whether it's in an email chain, or even if people are posting, spurious information on Facebook, we often want to combat that by, doing our fact check and telling people in public that they're wrong. And I would encourage everyone to do the opposite and maybe approach people through a direct message or approach them, more privately, because people are going to stake out their territory in public, and it's more likely. Actually, psychological research shows that when you're approaching people with fact checks, the wrong information is more likely to remain in their heads, which makes this a bit more difficult. But if you approach this on the human level, person to person and say, hey, I know you really care about this issue. Here's some information that I think you might want to know. And you do this privately and have a conversation at it, put that human element back into our online conversations, which is, even more important during this pandemic. I think that stands to help rather than getting into these knockdown, drag out fights, because, fact checking, we're not going to fact check our way out of the crisis of truth and trust that we face. We have to bring humanity back into the equation.
That's right. And so you speak about changing minds and informing the poster, but then there's also then limiting the spread. And so I do think it's important that users familiarize themselves with the reporting options. And many of those tools are now newly expanded. So newly expanded criteria for reporting posts as misinformation, disinformation, or election-related information that are available to all users. And so I think that's another important piece of this. Let's turn it back over to Ms. Slotkin.
Great, thank you, Congresswoman Underwood. Yeah, I've definitely seen what feels like a lot of people, just even in my own Facebook community, sort of saying, "Hey, folks," to those of you who are sending messages and spreading things, just ask you to really be judicious, report things that look funny, and we definitely want everyone, if something smells off, to flag it for the appropriate authorities, because I think we all need to be vigilant. Can you tell me a little bit more, and this can be for either of you, why don't we start with Ms. Jankowicz, but this new thing that I have not seen before in other disinformation campaigns, what is allegedly folks associated with the Chinese government carrying out a direct text message campaign to American citizens, allegedly, again, with false information about the coronavirus and how it started, where it got started. For our viewers, can you walk us through the specifics? Because this seems different than the last time many of us spoke on disinformation. We were talking about largely Russian disinformation related to our elections and the democratic process here and ads online. Talk to me about the text messaging, if you could, Ms. Jankowicz.
Sure. So I think this is a really interesting case study. And actually, it's a tactic that I first saw used in Ukraine by Russia. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Chinese were lifting that from the Russian playbook. In Ukraine, soldiers on the front lines were receiving text messages from Russian government officials, from those in the Donbass who were separatist soldiers, saying, you should abandon your positions. Your government doesn't care about you, and we're coming to get you. Basically, encouraging them to desert the army and go home, or threatening their families, and that's extremely scary. In this case, this was talking about lockdowns and states of emergency that were being instituted. And one thing I think is interesting about these messages, when you get a text message from someone, there's kind of a built-in trust already baked into that text message. You're more likely to trust that information, especially if it's in WhatsApp groups or things like that, which are becoming more and more popular in the United States. These things are getting broadcast to a large number of people at once and getting forwarded around. So according to the reporting, it started, again, as you said, from China, and people were either forwarding screenshots or forwarding these encrypted messages on WhatsApp. And again, it's coming from friends. So I'm sure you all had friends and family who were forwarding these messages to one another. And there's no real way to verify the source unless you're on the back end of that, which most Americans don't have access to. So I think the most important thing for people to do is, especially during these times, recognize that we're being emotionally and psychologically manipulated. Not only by foreign actors, but by domestic actors as well. And when you find something that's a little bit fishy or something that really makes you mad, the best thing to do, I think, is to practice informational distancing. Put the device down, let yourself calm down for a little bit, and then try to do some basic fact checking on that information. And trust information that is coming from experts and scientists and not necessarily politicians and pundits. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Congresswoman Underwood?
So, Ms. DiResta, as I mentioned, the issue of false information that threatens people's health and well-being is particularly important to me as a nurse. In fact, I'm planning to introduce legislation soon to address the impact and the threat of disinformation to public health and safety. Based on your work, what do you think that this committee needs to know as we consider legislative responses to this issue?
I think the number one thing is information sharing, right? The number one thing is ensuring that whatever legislative efforts are put in place, they do incorporate the existing research and counter disinformation uh, apparatus that exists both within the United States government already, as well as the community of researchers and civil society folks that are studying this problem on the outside. I think one of the interesting challenges that we see is that a lot of these tactics aren't actually new. So with the text messages, as Nina mentioned, we also saw the very first Internet Research Agency operation, Colombian Chemicals, did involve text messages pushing the idea that a chemical factory had exploded in Louisiana, and people turned to the internet to try to find information, and the results that they found there were information that were produced by the operatives in the form of fake tweets, fake text messages, fake websites, fake posts. And so again, one of the challenges is really ensuring that as we think about legislation to ensure that countering is done appropriately, that there is this kind of historical understanding that's incorporated into that process, that understanding of evolution. I think as I've seen some of the bill that's been proposed, one of the interesting things that I see is the ways in which it intersects with State Department's Global Engagement Center and some of the work that they've begun trying to do, some of the work that Department of Homeland Security has done on producing content to inform the public. There was that excellent pineapple pizza explaining disinformation and online manipulation and people being riled up through this little piece of content they made related to how strongly people feel about pineapple on their pizza. It was a simple meme, but it was a very effective campaign. It got shared widely. One of the real questions is, how do you produce PSAs and come up with legislative structures that are incorporating in some of the efforts that have already begun to take place?
Excellent. Thank you very much. Congresswoman Slotkin.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the issues that we've talked about in the committee, and Congresswoman Underwood and I have lamented many, many times, is that all the different social media companies have completely different standards, or very different standards, I should say, on like how frequently they will act, how quickly they will act, what their threshold for acting is for taking down information or flagging information, warning label on the information. And this is an issue that's far bigger than the issue of disinformation. We've had a concern about this for a long time as a committee, but can you kind of like walk us through how you think the different companies are doing? Who's acting really quickly? Who's taken a sort of stand back approach? Maybe we'll start with Ms. Jankowicz, and then I'd like to hear from Ms. DiResta as well. Just who's taking this really seriously? Who's taking a stand back approach? Walk us through the good, the bad, the ugly.
Well, we could be here all day if we did that, but I will try to give you the 40,000-foot view. I think that we've seen what can happen when the companies have the will to act over the past 6 weeks. There has been a lot of good progress on suppressing or removing content that is a real danger to public health related to coronavirus. But I would like to see the same standards applied to political misinformation and disinformation as well. I think the companies have come a long way since 2016, but it's not enough yet. Facebook in particular, I think, has applied its policies in an extremely inconsistent way. One thing I will congratulate Twitter for is their transparency related to takedowns. I like that, especially related to foreign disinformation, there have been, although it's not always the most accessible data set, they are posting their data about takedowns that researchers can explore, and we don't have the same sorts of transparency with Facebook. On the other hand, we have Google and YouTube, which are kind of a black box and escape, I think, a lot of criticism because people don't realize how Google and YouTube are affecting the information that they are getting back when people are performing searches on either of those platforms. So there's still a really long way to go. I totally agree with you that we need some bumpers on this bowling alley to make sure that we're using the same terminology. And of course, companies are going to respond different ways. They have the right to do that. They are private companies, but I think that's where Congress needs to step in and set some standards. And you know, I would say the United States has a real responsibility as the place where all of these companies were created and are headquartered set that responsibility, that democratic standard for the rest of the world, because countries all around the world, I think over 80 now, have pursued some form of social media regulation, and it's not always democratic. And the precedent that we set is going to have ripple effects around the world.
And to add to that, I think this is a challenge of balancing free expression with mitigating harm, right? And one of the key challenges we have is that since 2017, the remove, reduce, inform, and other moderation frameworks that have been developed really are in many ways best suited to the very bright line of dealing with foreign interference. And as it becomes harder to attribute something to foreign interference, or as again we've seen with increasing franchising and incorporating locals directly into regional influence operations, we've seen this in Africa, Russia running operations out of Africa using natives to the countries who then in turn are producing content for their fellow citizens. It's very, very hard to detect that sort of thing. So when we look at understanding how we should be treating these as in a kind of almost actor agnostic point of view, one of the really interesting things is looking at behaviors, is looking at what is getting a lot of uptake, what is getting a lot of distribution, and really aligning the policies around responding rapidly to things that are beginning to emerge. Twitter, I think, they do a great job at transparently putting things out after the fact. Facebook does these monthly reports. YouTube really could stand to be a whole lot better on that front. But I think the key challenge for us right now, particularly as it becomes harder to attribute in real time, is actually thinking about that, again, balancing that free expression with the possibility of harm and knowing when to act. I don't think we necessarily want one moderation framework to rule the entirety of the internet. I think there's a lot of challenges to that approach. I think there's a lot of people will feel that that it's all being done in coordination by kind of big tech overlords, as opposed to the nuances of individual kind of cultural and social experiences on various platforms. But I think ultimately the problem repeatedly over and over again is that the inform function and the reduce function, they're too slow to deploy them. So the thing is already viral by the time they begin to use those policy tools at their disposal, which just creates a secondary problem when they do finally use them. And then again, there's that narrative that that the content has subsequently been censored. So this is, I think the challenge is really getting the timing right for a lot of these things. The policies are there, but the application time is not quite there yet.
I love that point that you just made at the end, that if they have the tools, how you deploy them and when you deploy them make all the difference in the way that the public receives the information that it was disinformation. Certainly something I hadn't considered. We are just about out of time. Before we wrap up, I want to give everybody a chance to share a closing thought, starting with our panelists. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell the committee today to inform our continuing response to misinformation during this pandemic? And we'll go first to Mr. Resta.
Thank you. I think I would reiterate the point about collaboration and cooperation. This is really a multi-stakeholder effort. We need our government, we need Congress, we need civil society, we need doctors at this point really out there communicating information to the public. I think that there's two ways that this goes. Either, and they're not necessarily in opposition, but as we think about new policies and new implementations, new ways of managing the infrastructure, that's one thing. But in the very near term, we need to be thinking about ensuring that that expertise and authoritative voices with solid information are out there, participating in the conversation and really doing the work of debunking and ensuring that good information is making it to the public. So filling that content void with better information, while thinking about, in the longer game, what to do about the information architecture itself.
Thank you so much. Ms. Jankowicz, any final comments?
So I think I would just underline again that disinformation is not a partisan issue. It really affects our democratic process. It affects public safety and national security. We need transparency and fact-based communication from our elected officials and from officials across government. And we can't hope to fight disinformation if we are engaging in those tactics ourselves. And until we realize that, we're making so much progress on the civil society level, on the research level, in some bureaus across government that are doing great work, but I fear that it's all being undermined when we have this inconsistent messaging and disregard of the facts coming from certain parts of government. So again, disinformation is democratic, small d, not partisan. Thanks.
Thank you. And now I'd like to invite my colleague, Congresswoman Slotkin, to share her final remarks.
Great. Thank you, Congresswoman, for hosting this and for getting us all together. I think it's just we're seeing what I take away from the conversation is one, that we've really seen the activation of these disinformation networks and an amping up of disinformation as they're trying to take advantage of the moment. They've always been there. This stuff has gone on, but it's really taking an interesting turn, especially since we don't know everything about the virus, right? We don't have complete information. We see state-sponsored actors, non-state sponsored actors. We see foreign actors, we see domestic actors. And when then on the receiving end in social media, as Mr. Esther was saying, we're seeing these uneven standards. Some folks are really vigilant, some folks aren't. And so it leaves me in the same place I've been on other issues related to the spread of disinformation, is that we just need a little bit more rigor in terms of what we as consumers of social media, how our critical, our eyes are going to be on this information. We need to educate ourselves and second guess when we see something new and sort of strange and shocking. We need to question it. I think that's a healthy thing. And so we need digital literacy to go up. But I, again, really do believe that there's a role for our social media companies to be coming together and looking at what are the best recommendations and how do they streamline that? I always think about the American Medical Association. It's a professional association that gives advice on best practices to the doctors of this country. And doctors around the world, around the country, look to that as sort of a standard setting. And I am a passionate believer, now more than ever, we need the same thing from our social media companies. That if everyone's doing different things, we don't have a set of common standards, well, it's unsurprising when it's going to be completely confusing for the consumer and a great opportunity for those sowing disinformation. So thanks for holding this. Thanks to our visitors and our guests for coming and bringing your expertise. And back over to you, Congresswoman Underwood.
Well, thank you so much to both of our panelists, Ms. Renee DiResta of the Stanford Internet Observatory and Ms. Nina Jankowicz of the Wilson Center. The spread of false and potentially dangerous claims during a legal pandemic clearly poses a threat to our national security. Misinformation about COVID-19 has proliferated rapidly since the virus emerged earlier this year. And when it comes to vital public health information, the stakes are life and death. The coronavirus misinformation borrows from other well-known disinformation tactics that we've talked about today, right? Employed by China, Russia, Iran, and other state actors that tends to seize upon pre-existing social and ideologic divisions and distrust in institutions, undermining confidence in our health authorities, and preying on fears about the health and safety of loved ones. The federal government and all of our private sector partners have to employ the lessons learned from previous disinformation campaigns to counter the effects to spread disinformation during this crisis. And more importantly, the federal government has to ensure that Americans are able to find and identify reliable information on how to keep their families safe during this crisis. That information can be found at cdc.gov for those listening today. The committee is